Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tania Haddad. I'm the director of the Global Engagement Initiative and the interim chairperson of the Department of Political Studies and Public Administration at AUB. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's discussion on how power sharing deals, elite compromises, and negotiated settlements have shaped post-uprising politics in the Arab world and what broader lessons they hold for political systems globally. In moments of rupture, negotiated settlements are often framed as pragmatic necessities. They promise stability and a pathway away from violence. Yet, over time, these arrangements can produce unintended outcomes: blurred accountability, fragmented authority, institutional stagnation, and growing public frustration. When elite agreements become the central organizing principle of governance, we must ask what happens to citizen trust, representation, and reform. We are privileged to be joined today by two distinguished scholars whose work speaks directly to these questions. Dr. Sharan Grewal is Assistant Professor of Government at American University and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He received his PhD in politics from Princeton University in 2018. His research examines revolutions and democratic transitions, particularly in the Arab world. His forthcoming book, The Rise and Fall of Tunisian Democracy, Populism, Polarization, and the Perils of Power Sharing, published by Cambridge University Press, provides a timely analysis of Tunisia's democratic trajectory and the structural tensions embedded in elite compromise. We are also joined by our colleague, Dr. Ohannes Geukjian, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Studies and Public Administration at the American University of Beirut. He holds a PhD in peace studies from the University of Bradford in the United Kingdom and specializes in ethnic conflict, nationalism, peace building, conflict management, and conflict resolution. His forthcoming book, State Failure in Lebanon: Causes and Implication, published by Routledge, offers a deep structural examination of Lebanon's political system and the long-term consequences of negotiated settlements and elite accommodation. Our conversation will be moderated by Mr. Roupen Avsharian. After beginning his studies at the American University of Beirut, he moved to the United States during the Civil War. He later earned his Juris Doctor from Western State University College of Law in California in 1995 and a master's degree in national security studies with emphasis on the Middle East. Mr. Avsharian is a member of the Middle East Studies Association. He has presented research on Middle Eastern studies at academic symposia in several countries. With such a distinguished panel and a moderator, we look forward to a thoughtful and rigorous exchange on what these cases reveal, not only about the Arab world, but also about the broader lessons they hold for political systems globally. Thank you all for being here. Roupen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tanya, for a wonderful introduction. The first question I'm going to ask Dr. Grewal. After President Zain al-Abidin bin Ali's authoritarian rule was dramatically changed by the Jasmine Revolution in 2011, followed by the adoption of a new constitution in 2014, and the rising of President Kais Saied in 2019 as a populist figure. Sharan, why do you think Tunisia has shifted back to authoritarianism in the recent years? Do you consider Tunisia currently as a failed state, and why? And what lessons drawn from that failure can be applied to other governments today?
Thank you, Roupen, and thank you, Tanya, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for coming. Let me preface my remarks by first saying that I have a 4-month-old baby, so I may not be as cogent as I would like to be. But thanks for the opportunity to present this forthcoming book. And so the book, as Roupen and Tanya mentioned, is looking at why Tunisia's democracy died. And as you all know, Tunisia had been the one success story of the Arab Spring, the one country to make it to democracy and seemingly to keep democracy. But after 10 years, in 2021, Tunisia's democracy also collapsed. You had a populist president, Kais Saied, who decided on July 25th, 2021, to shut down the parliament, to send the military to close down the parliament, to dismiss the prime minister, and to govern instead alone by decree. In the subsequent years, he would rewrite the constitution to create a hyper-presidential system where he is in charge. He would repress all of the political parties, and he would recreate a dictatorship in Tunisia. And so the question of the book is, why did this happen when it seemed like everything was going well in Tunisia? In fact, from the outside, it seemed like everyone in Tunisia was doing what they were supposed to do. What the literature on democratic transitions tells you to do is to govern together, to share power, to compromise, to find consensus. And this is exactly what Tunisians were doing. In the wake of the Arab Spring Revolution, you had all of the parties come together to decide on a roadmap. In that roadmap, the first step were elections, and that produced a grand coalition government that brought together the Islamist party, Ennahda, as well as two secular parties. So you bridged this major divide between Islamists and secularists that have hampered transitions elsewhere in the region. In Tunisia, they were able to put aside their differences and find common ground, create a grand coalition government that brought everyone together. Later, when there were tensions, once again, they found consensus. They brought everyone to the table in a national dialogue and created a new constitution almost unanimously across the different parties. And then finally, at the next election, you saw another round of power sharing. In the wake of the 2014 elections, the major Islamist and secular parties once again decided to govern together. Ennahda and Nida Tunis governed together from 2015 onwards. And so from the outside, it seemed like Tunisia was doing everything right. It was putting aside their differences and finding consensus, creating their new democracy together. And indeed, they won a Nobel Peace Prize for all of these efforts to share power and find consensus. But what I argue in the book is that there was a dark side to all of this power sharing and this continued consensus. What I argue is that consensus was the right strategy to take at the start of the transition, when you were setting up the new constitution, setting up the electoral system, deciding on the rules of the game, the rules of democracy. All of that required consensus between all of the parties. But once you've established the rules of the game, you actually needed to transition to more competitive politics, normal politics with a clear government and an opposition, not continued power sharing and continued grand coalitions between the major parties. What happened in Tunisia is that as the major parties continued to govern together, and I'm in particular referring to the decision in 2014 for Nida Tunis and Ennahda to govern together starting in 2015 in that grand coalition government, that decision would end up sowing the seeds for democracy's demise in Tunisia. And it did so in two ways. The first is that the Grand Coalition government actually made polarization worse. And this is ironic because the two parties coming together thought they were dampening polarization by coming together. They thought they would depolarize the country if the major Islamist and major secular party came together. But what happened instead is that the two major parties collapsed by the next elections. Nida Tunis would win just 3 seats in the next elections, and Ennahda would lose half of its votes by the next elections. The center collapsed as a result of coming together, and instead you had the emergence of hardliners on both sides. And the reason is because the grievances the Islamists and the secularists had were genuine. They were real. They couldn't simply be swept under the rug with a grand coalition among the elites. Instead, the grievances among the Islamist camp, that they wanted some of the secular old regime figures investigated and prosecuted for the crimes committed under the dictatorship. They wanted real transitional justice. That was swept aside when Ennahda instead formed a coalition with the old regime, passed a reconciliation law that gave amnesty to the old regime. And so you saw frustrations among the Islamist camp that led to the rise of a hardline Islamist party, the Karama coalition, that instead was more revolutionary and wanted to purge the old regime. And you saw the mirror image on the secular side, where this alliance between Nida Tunis and Ennahda, the center, frustrated the hardline secularists and led them to form their own party that instead of compromising with the Islamists, wanted instead to prosecute the Islamists for the crimes that they believed the Islamists committed while they were in power, in terms of turning a blind eye to the Salafists, to assassinations of secular politicians, to sending foreign fighters to ISIS. All of those the secularists wanted the Islamists investigated for, and yet those were swept under the rug as part of this power sharing, as part of this consensus. And so you had real grievances among the hardliners in the secularist and Islamist camps, which led them then to form hardline parties that made polarization even worse. And so by the next elections, you had a very polarized, fragmented parliament with hardline secularists and Islamists even coming to blows, fistfights in the parliament that in turn delegitimized the parliament and paved the way for Kais Saied to dissolve it. So one theoretical thread here is that power sharing led polarization to get even worse. The second thread, though, is that power sharing sparked the rise of populism. When you had all of the mainstream parties governing together, all of the establishment parties came to be seen as the same, as all corrupt, as all having captured the system, making decisions from behind the scenes that don't really represent their bases, instead doling out ministerial positions for each other. It painted the system and it gave rise to this populist critique that all the parties are corrupt, the system is corrupt, and we need to really purge the system. And that fed into the populist critique of Kais Saied, who campaigned in 2019 on precisely this platform, that the parties are corrupt and need to be prosecuted and even dissolved. And that populism, in turn, fueled both the electoral victory of Kais Saied, as well as his decision to then dissolve the parliament and go after all of the parties in its wake. And these two dynamics, this polarization and this populism, have continued to inhibit any resistance to the self-coup in Tunisia, this presidential coup by Kais Saied. The opposition is unable to resist, is unable to unite, given that heightened polarization. They cannot unite against Kais Saied. And in addition, even if they could, the populism in society means that these mainstream parties don't have much support, and Kais Saied retains the popularity to continue to govern in the fashion he is. So that's, in a nutshell, the argument for why Tunisia's democracy died. Roupen, you asked me one final question there about whether this generalizes to other transitions. So let me take 2 minutes as well to speak to that, which is that I find in the book, I have one chapter here about parallels in other transitions that we've seen similarly how power sharing between the major powers actually led democracy to die rather than saving the democratic transition. You see this, of course, elsewhere in the Middle East, and I won't steal Ohannes' thunder, but you see this in Lebanon and Iraq, where you had consociational systems that brought together all of the different sectarian factions that eventually got perceived as a corrupt deal, the elites having captured the system, and in turn led to a very populist blowback in the form of the 2019 uprisings that were calling for the overthrow of these power-sharing consociational systems. You see this also in Afghanistan post-US invasion, where you had several contested elections in 2014 and 2019, where the two major candidates at the end of these elections formed a power-sharing deal and governed together in 2014 and 2019. That frustrated the voters on all sides, who felt that the elections don't even matter anymore if at the end of the day the major candidates are turning around and governing together. It reduced the investment in elections and in the system, and led therefore very few to defend the system in the wake of the Taliban's invasion in 2021. You see this also beyond the Middle East. In Latin America, you can similarly see stories of how foundational pacts and alliances between the mainstream parties helped at first for establishing democracy, but eventually led to a populist backlash against these mainstream parties. You see this in Bukele, for instance. You see this story also for Hugo Chavez. You see this for Evo Morales. But Mexico perhaps is one that is less well known, where similarly, the three major parties historically in Mexico, the PRI, the PAN, and the PRD, they came together in 2012 in a pact for Mexico. And that power sharing, that alliance between the three establishment parties, similarly led the population to view them as similar, as corrupt, and in turn led to a populist backlash in the form of a new party, Morena, which has dominated elections since. And you also see, finally, some parallels in Europe and the United States. The jury is still out in terms of whether this will lead to democratic breakdown, but you see similar dynamics where alliances between the mainstream parties led to a populist backlash. You see it, for instance, in Germany, where in an attempt to fend off the Alternative for Germany, the right-wing populist party, the mainstream parties continue to form grand coalition governments, the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats together. And each time it decreases the popularity of the center parties and fuels the popularity of the AfD as the center parties continue to form these grand coalitions rather than championing their bases. And you see it finally in the United States, where there is, in some sense, the rise of populists in the US, Trump on the right, but also Bernie Sanders on the left, in part stems from too much of a bipartisan consensus among the two major parties. And I think the most important example is on trade policy, where the bipartisan consensus on free trade for decades, in turn led to a populist backlash on both the left and the right, calling for more protectionist measures. This is Bernie Sanders calling for more protectionist measures. And of course, it's Trump calling for tariffs as he is implementing today. You see a similar populist backlash to the bipartisan consensus, the mainstream consensus. And so the overall lesson, and let me close here, is that once you've established the rules of the game, parties need to represent their bases. They need to compete with each other. They need to differentiate themselves from each other. They even need a little bit of polarization. That's how you keep the population invested in these parties and invested in the system. If you don't have that differentiation and polarization, you instead fuel the rise of hardliners and populists, who in turn are a bigger threat to the new democracy. So let me close there, and thanks.
Thank you, Sharan, for this. And going to Ohannes, how does this compare to what happened in Lebanon? As you know, United States Special Envoy for Syria, Tom Barak, characterized Lebanon as a failed state in a remark at the IISS Manama Dialogue Conference in Bahrain this past November 2025. And a United Nations expert at the Human Rights Office at the High Commissioner also had warned a few years ago that Lebanon was a failing state. Ohannes, what are the key internal or external factors that contributed to the Lebanese failure? Do you think the unwritten Lebanese national pact between Christians and Muslims can still bring about state building in Lebanon?
All right. Thank you very much for introducing introducing us. Thank you, Tania and Roupen, and thank you to all those who contributed to this webinar. Actually, there are some similarities, but the Lebanese case is unique. The assumption was to start with Tom Barak's statement. Indeed, Lebanon has become a failed state. And there are internal and external causes. In my book, I examine a century of attempts by the Lebanese political elites to build the state, but unfortunately, they have been unable to build the state. Sectarianism in this context has become the enemy of state legitimacy and state building at the same time, and nation building. The assumption was from the beginning, when the Lebanese state was created in 1920, the assumption was that in a multi-ethnic, multi-group society, the power sharing system could be the best to accommodate the differences between the parties and make policy accordingly. And consensus democracy was thought to be successful, so that, I mean, the Lebanese political elites who represented the main groups in the coalition governments would be able to manage their differences and go ahead with strengthening the institutions of the state and build the state. But the problem was this power sharing system gave privileges to the Lebanese groups, communities, you can say, and rather than pursuing the national interests of the country and strengthening state institutions, the coalition governments, the parties represented in the coalition governments, pursued sectarian interests, the interests of their groups, of their sects, rather than pursuing the national interest. And all of them, without exception, they refused to abandon part of their privileges because that was viewed as weakness, uh, starting with education, schooling, uh, certain autonomy, clubs, so on and so forth. So those privileges were maintained for a long time. Now, a number of times, the Lebanese elites were invited to national dialogues in order to actually reconcile their differences and think about common goals so that state institutions state institutions were strengthened, but certainly these dialogues ended up with no results. During these dialogues, at the same time, the political elites representing the various groups were called to renegotiate the power sharing arrangements, and this did happen, for example, after the collapse of the state in 1975, and later on after the 2006 war, after the Ta'if, before the 2006 war, after the Ta'if, because the Ta'if was renegotiating the power sharing agreements. That was the Ta'if. But the problem was that the Ta'if actually ended the civil war and did not resolve the conflict in Lebanon related to identity, although it was mentioned in the constitution that the issue of identity is raised, and there was the false conception that the identity conflict was resolved. However, I mean, it was not. So the Ta'if was negotiated after the civil war in order to strengthen institutions, rebuild the state and the nation at the same time. We should not ignore rebuilding the nation. The divided, nation between and among the groups comprising the nation. Uh, Unfortunately, the provisions of the Ta'if constitution were not implemented, and as a matter of fact, I can tell you that there are 7 essential provisions of the Ta'if agreement that were not implemented, and there are actually 8 essential provisions that were violated by the various groups and governments at the same time. So the consecutive power sharing governments avoided the implementation of uh, particular provisions of the Ta'if, and probably that hindered democracy and the development of democracy, because power sharing at the end of the day did not contribute to building democracy and developing democracy. A number of times democratic processes were hindered. For example, uh, the terms that were specified in the constitution concerning parliamentary elections and presidential elections were not respected. A number of times the Lebanese parliament extended themselves for themselves. I mean, this was certainly violation of the constitution, without going back to the people, to elections, so that a real representative parliament was elected. The same applies to presidential elections. A number of times the terms were not respected, and Lebanon remained a number of times without a president and without a government. And the country, you could wonder how the country was run without a government, without a president, and sometimes without a parliament being convened in order to legislate and make laws accordingly. According to the Ta'if, for example, culturally, socially, and economically balanced development was the mainstay of the state's unity and of the stability of the system. This never happened. It was clear that, I mean, uh, uh, cultural, social, economic development was to take place in all the regions to reduce poverty, inequality, provide employment opportunities, so on and so forth. Instead, the Lebanese political elites, all of them, were complicit in state failure. They were complicit in not being able to manage the problems of the country, and financial, economic, monetary, and definitely, I mean, the grand coalition governments that were supposed to build the state and manage the differences and bring development and development of democracy, it did not take place. So I examine in the book 100 years from 1920 until 2020, 100 years of failed attempts to build the nation and to build the state and to strengthen the institutions. So internally, on the one hand, the book focuses on the policies of the coalition governments, grand coalition governments. Externally, on the other hand, the book also focuses on external actors from the region and from outside the region who intervened in Lebanon in order to support one group against the other. But the vice versa was also correct. For example, the internal groups in Lebanon at the domestic level, all of them, without exception, when uh, they wanted to mobilize for particular interests, they sought the support of their external patron. And the external patron was ready to support the client, the internal group, against other groups. And this has been the history of of the country, by the way, since independence. So rarely you find moments of agreement and consensus, but soon those agreements and consensus actually broke because sectarianism prevented any sort of development of democracy in the country. And definitely corruption, parallel to that, corruption did play a role. There was no accountability, no time. Uh, uh, I mean, Lebanese political elites were held accountable. No time there was real attempt uh, to make sound economic policy so that actually fiscal and structural and monetary policy at the same time, so that fiscal and structural actually reform takes place. Uh, no time there was a real attempt to reduce the deficit in the budget. You could imagine, for example, from 2005 until 2017, there was no budget at all, and the government spent money without having a budget on the table. It did not know the revenues and it did not know the expenses, and there was no accountability. This was an example, by the way, not the only example, but I mean, I'm trying to explain how the country was run. Uh, for 100 years without being able to build the state and develop democracy. So power sharing, that the assumption of power sharing that it could actually address the problems of the country and bring democratic development did not happen. A number of times, uh, uh, international rating agencies and external actors uh, warned the Lebanese governments to be careful and to introduce structural and fiscal reform, but actually, all those warnings uh, 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 did not bring any result, mainly because the Lebanese political elites, including the Central Bank of Lebanon, thought that Lebanon's reserves, currency reserves, were strong enough to avoid uh, collapse or default or whatever. Uh, so internal and external factors are examined in the book, because the external actually has been also important. Uh, the clients at the local level and the patrons at the regional and global level, external level, did contribute to state failure. And the main problems that the country has been facing for a long time: government deadlock. After the elections, for example, parliamentary elections, it took the Lebanese political elites a long time to form a government, a power sharing government. Sometimes it took them more than a year. And the country was run without a government. So government deadlock uh, was a recurring phenomena in the history, political history of the country. Sectarian rhetoric, mobilization during the elections in order to realize sectarian ends, goals, rather than the national interest. The trash problem has been recurring for a long time. Pollution, alarming levels. Corruption, again, uh, that preceded failure, as I explain in the book, and no time there was accountability. Unemployment rates increased, reached 30% and 35%. Illegal weapons in the country, violation of sovereignty. And this brings us to what Robert Jackson in his book said: if any state is unable to transform juridical sovereignty to empirical sovereignty, then that is not a state at all. Meaning that Lebanon was never able to control its borders, so there was no empirical sovereignty. Uh, Smuggling, actually another problem. Over 1.5 million refugees after the Syrian crisis added to the internal problems. It cost Lebanon 1 billion annually. The electricity deficit, uh, actually, uh, uh, the public debt is estimated 100 billion in Lebanon, about 150% of GDP. 40 billion of that debt was actually because of the electricity. EDL, Electricity du Liban, was unable to reform and unable to provide. So the subsidies provided by the governments to the Electricity du Liban, to the company, a state-run company, you could imagine 40 billion debt accumulated only from the electricity sector. Bankruptcy. So what Tom Barak said, going back to what you introduced in your question, he was right. I mean, Lebanon has become a failed state, and Lebanon is bankrupt. Uh, Local currency has been in jeopardy. The dollar, actually, liquidity became a problem, devaluation of the currency, but the banking sector collapsed, so on and so forth. So the book assesses and examines all these factors, internal, external, all the signals, political, economic, security. And the main argument of the book is that all the governments, coalition governments, the grand coalition governments, were unable to provide the political goods necessary for the people. And that was sufficient cause to state failure. And by political goods, we mean the primary political goods: security, infrastructure, education, conducive environment for economic development, political participation, fair and transparent elections. So all these come under the political goods that were not provided accordingly to the people. And in my conclusion, to cut it short, I do say that this system doesn't work anymore. It needs an overhaul. Power sharing, the drawbacks of power sharing has been much more than the benefits of power sharing that brought to Lebanese society. Now, similarities, differences, application, or what lessons could be learned from Lebanon. We have some conflicts around us, including Syria, including Iraq, Libya. I mean, where we witness state failure and power sharing actually drawbacks. Even in the West, sometimes after the elections in Belgium, it took them 8 months, 9 months, sometimes more to form a government. But definitely those examples are much more successful than the Lebanese case, mainly because the groups there are less, whereas in Lebanon you have much more, 18 groups, and you need to find consensus between and among each other. Anyway, I mean, uh, uh, we look forward to the Q&A, probably to clarify much more.
Thank you, Ohannes, for the presentation. Going back to Sharan, you touched upon, in a general sense, on what may be a better path for parties to come together when establishing a democracy. But then a competition between parties must come back with a leading and an opposition party at all times. Can you speak to this in a more detail? How does this work in reality? How could things have gone differently in Tunisia?
It's a great question, and it's hard to prove the counterfactual, which is that if the Islamist Party and the Secular Party in 2015 didn't govern together, maybe democracy would have survived. The proposal I would have put forth and that they had debated at the time was Nida Tunis, the winning party, the Secular Party, would lead the government and the Islamist Party would lead the opposition. In my mind, that would have allowed these two parties to survive long term. It's because they governed together that both of them lost their bases. Both of their bases were antagonistic towards each other, didn't want compromise with the other. And so it's because they decided to govern together that they collapsed moving forward and led to hardliners and populists. Had they kept their distance, had Ennahda led the opposition and Nida Tunis led the government, perhaps both of these parties would have been able to keep their bases and therefore crowd out both the hardliners and the populists in the next elections, and you would have had, in essence, the creation of a two-party system, two clearly differentiated parties moving forward in Tunisia. The other aspect here that I didn't get to touch on the first time around is the economic situation and how that interacted with power sharing. When all of the parties are governing together, the Islamists and the secularists, and the economy is sluggish as it was in Tunisia, everyone got tainted by the poor economy. It led the populace then to rise as all of the establishment got tainted. If instead one of the mainstream parties, the Islamists in this case, had been in the opposition, it would have been able to keep its reputation clean and ride that economic frustration back into power. And so in some ways, the economic stagnation in Tunisia was exacerbated by this decision to all govern together and have this grand coalition. Had they not, perhaps Tunisia's democracy would have been able even to survive the poor economic situation.
Well, thank you, Sharon. Now, we're opening for Q&A session. If any listeners have any questions, please do so and send them to the link as indicated. Now, there's a question to Dr. Geukjian. What does the future hold for Lebanon? what is a path forward that can maintain the peace, but also function as an effective government and properly address the issues of the country?
All right. This is a very important question. As I said a while ago, the system needs an overhaul. This system doesn't work anymore, and it is unable to build the peace. Uh, First of all, there should be deconfessionalization of the system, or we may say desectarianization of the system. And what was mentioned in the Ta'if, that sectarianism was to be uh, removed after a period of time, they did not implement it. Uh, so going on with this failed actually system will bring no value and no result. You need to shift to a civil state. Otherwise, I mean, it's hopeless because the same political parties would continue pursuing their particular uh, and actually very narrow goals that serve their interests only without actually pursuing the interests of the state. There is no other solution, by the way. The system proved that it is not workable anymore.
Thank you.
In addition, if you allow, Rupen, in addition, I mean, in order to live in peace, because the environment is also important, in order to live in peace and stability, I mean, the Lebanese political elites, or you may call them the governments, uh, need to think about establishing peace with neighbors and living in peace with neighbors. Also, the other issue that is very important, uh, the monopoly of legitimate violence. I mean, maintaining or keeping groups, some groups, or one major group in the country with and ignoring its weapons uh, is an additional factor that causes actually failure and fear. Other groups definitely will not accept this. So back to the issue of sovereignty and legitimacy. If this issue is not solved, and if Lebanon would be unable to maintain peace with its to reach peace agreements with its neighboring states, then it becomes very difficult to fix to think about the future.
Thank you. I have a question for Sharan. The question is, what is next for Tunisia? Do you see any future cooperation between the Islamists and the secular forces in Tunisia to promote democracy?
In the short term, no, but eventually, yes. I mean, the same dynamics that occurred under Ben Ali's dictatorship, where everyone was repressed and therefore everyone found common ground. The Islamists and secularists realized that Ben Ali was the major enemy and so united against him. That same dynamic will play out in the coming years in Tunisia. Similarly, Kais Saied has repressed all of the parties from the hardline secularists to the hardline Islamists. Eventually, those parties will realize that the bigger threat is President Kais Saied and unite against him. Whether that leads to a return to democracy is another question, though, because beyond that inability to unite in the moment, you have the broader issue of popular frustration with all of these parties. Even if they were to unite, they don't have that much popularity at the moment. It would require them really to reinvent themselves so that they can regain some of this popularity. But also, most importantly, for Kais Saied's popularity to decline. At the moment, he retains a groundswell of support, right? Even though the economy is not any better under Kais Saied, actually things have gotten a lot worse, he is not getting the blame, right? Because he's able to blame, to scapegoat really the political parties, the businessmen of the last decade, the sub-Saharan African migrants that he says are invading the country. He's even able to blame the United States and Europe and other foreign powers. He's able to blame enough other parties for the economic situation that Kais Saied's popularity is not yet getting hurt. Eventually, though, I do think he will lose popularity. And that is the moment where we will see potentially a restoration of democracy. But even there, and I'm going to end here on a pessimistic note, I do think that the challenges to restoring democracy next time around are going to be a little bit more difficult than they were in 2011. The factors that helped Tunisia become a democracy in the first place, in terms of an apolitical military, in terms of a strong civil society, these factors have changed to some extent for next time around. The military is now part and parcel of Kais Saied's regime because he dragged them into politics to shut down this parliament. He appointed many military officers as ministers, as Minister of Agriculture, Minister of Health, etc. The military has become closer to power, not politicized, but at least closer to power, less apolitical than it was last time around. So that might prove to be a challenge the next time Tunisia democratizes. Similarly, in terms of a strong civil society, the labor union that helped Tunisia democratize the first time around, that's also weakened today. The UGTT, the labor union, has lost considerable popularity, its ability to mobilize. It had seen as having become co-opted by Kais Saied and, of course, the governments before that, to the point where civil society is a bit weaker today than it was the first time around. And so I'm a little bit pessimistic that democracy will be so easy to restore post Kais Saied, but still remain hopeful that, yes, there is a path forward.
Sharan. Ohannes, you hinted in your presentation that external, regional, or international factors contributed directly or indirectly throughout the decades in coercing Lebanon to become a failed state. Would you elaborate how foreign regimes penetrated into Lebanon's internal politics? And how were they able to influence negatively on the domestic aspirations of the Lebanese political parties and lead the state to into a total failure?
Among those, Syria, for example, for a long time, after the civil war ended, after the Ta'if was negotiated, I mean, Syria did play a negative role rather than strengthening, helping in building the state. It weakened, actually. So it contributed to state failure because Syrian presence in Lebanon, actually, the aim of the Syrian presence in Lebanon was not to build a strong state, definitely. But it was, I mean, the aim was much more economic and political, to gain influence and benefit from Lebanon economically. Keeping Lebanon weak certainly serves Syrian interests. Iran, on the other hand, did play a role after 1979, in part, particularly after 1982, when Hezbollah was created in Lebanon. The party was created by Iran in order to export the revolution, and in order to extend Iranian influence in the region. That did take place because the state was weak, and the Iranians succeeded in building proxies in the region, because in a weak state, it was very easy to do that. Israel, on the other hand, actually, there's a long history, did violate the sovereignty of Lebanon. On the other hand, the Lebanese army was not strong enough to repel, let's say, such threats. France did try to help Lebanon. It was positive intervention by France. The United States, on the other hand, tried to support the Lebanese army in order to strengthen state institutions, armed forces, but actually those positive interventions. So we can talk about positive and negative interventions. Such interventions, although strengthened to a certain extent the Lebanese armed forces, internal security forces, but that was not enough. The regional, I mean, Lebanon became actually the backyard where regional powers tried to address their conflicts and try to solve their problems in the country. Because it was weak, because the central government was unable to protect sovereignty, and maintain rule of law and prevent control the porous borders. It was a conducive environment for regional actors who were trying to extend their influence actually in the region, mainly Syria and Iran in particular.
Ohannes, I have a question from the audience to Sharan, and it says, it seems that while power sharing is often criticized for being ineffective for governance and long-term democracy, some degree of common grounds remains essential. Could you provide an example of where and when this approach has been successful? Also, would those successful models apply to countries in transition where power sharing is frequently used as a recipe for setting internal strife?
Is a great question. So what are the successful models to follow if Tunisia turns out was not? I think perhaps the most useful one would be South Africa, where you similarly was an unlikely case for democracy, right? Very strong polarization between Black and white South Africans. And they were able to transition and establish democracy through power sharing initially, right? In 1994, you had both the major party representing the Black Africans, the African National Congress, together in a coalition with the party representing white Africans, the National Party. And it was through that grand coalition, through a consensus, that they produced the new constitution for South Africa. But after that, they separated, they parted ways. The ANC led the government, and the party that was representing the white South Africans, at that point it was called the Democratic Alliance, it led the opposition. And so once the rules of the game were established, the major parties separated, governed, and led the opposition respectively. And that has produced a stable democracy for 20 years, till today, actually. Now they have started to recreate a grand coalition and power sharing, and it is in fact undermining the ANC's popularity to once again create a grand coalition. But that, I think, would be the model to follow, is that power sharing is useful at the start of the transition to get consensus on the rules of the game, but then you have to transition to competition. And I think the way to think about it in terms of general lessons for democracies is that you want consensus over the rules of the game, right? If you're trying to change the rules of the game, those require additional consensus. If you're trying to change the electoral law, the electoral system, the constitution, on those issues, you need consensus. But in terms of policy, you don't want consensus. In terms of actual policies, the parties need to differentiate themselves so people feel represented, so people feel like they have choices in the elections. So that's the distinction I would make between policies and the rules of the game, in terms of, yes, you need continued common ground and consensus over the rules, but not over policies.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sharan Grewal and Dr. Ohannes Geukjian, for an outstanding presentation on power sharing issues in Tunisia and also in Lebanon. And I'll ask Tania to have her closing remarks.
Thank you, Roupen. Today's panel reminded us of a central lesson. Power sharing does not automatically produce good governance. Stability without accountability can generate stagnation. Elite compromise without institutional reform can undermine legitimacy. And without trust between state and society, no political arrangement, written or unwritten, can endure. The lesson is clear. Negotiated settlements must be paired with institutional building, transparency, and mechanisms that restore citizens' confidence. I would like to thank our distinguished speakers, Sharan and Ohannes, for their thoughtful and deeply analytical contributions, and Roupen for skillfully moderating this important conversation. I would also like to thank all of you for being here and for engaging with the panel. This event is part of the Global Engagement Initiative at AUB, based out of the Depth Center in New York City. Through this initiative, we aim to develop long-lasting partnership that fosters scholarly connections and expand access to research and knowledge across disciplines, emphasizing research specific to the Middle East and the Arab world while maintaining global significance. We will be circulating a follow-up email with the recording of this panel, so please stay tuned. Thank you again for joining, and goodbye.